Hello there. So the last couple of months have certainly been interesting. There have been revolving discussions from several outlets over certain sets of data regarding whether or not the country is safe to even open currently. So a lot of this is tied to whether or not people are familiar with the way that science related or STEM fields even work and operate and the discourses therein. Also, it can be difficult to convince an entire nation to stay at home, especially if they aren't familiar with how to interpret this information. So, for those familiar with the lengthy process of conducting research, compiling data, laying out methodologies, and how other people can replicate your tests and results, the process can be lengthy. And those not familiar with it just simply think that the people doing these studies aren't good at their jobs, are taking too long, or just aren't reliable sources of information. So, why is it like this though? Well, it all relates to genre, which is my favorite thing to talk about. Um, Within the course of the rhetoric and pedagogy in writing for science, is that the course was designed in interacting with a variety of texts, discussing how they worked, and then going through the history of how scientific journals became the standard form that they are now, what fields they influence, such as sociology, psychology, things like that, and just the way that these kind of genres uptake things from others. If you're tired of hearing genre, you can't imagine how much I am of hearing the word genre. So the work in this class was scaffolded in, as I discussed, learning about genres, their uptakes and influences in other discourses, then learning about these textual and contextual analyses, how they work, what good are they, along with certain types of reading strategies such as think aloud protocols, which I'll be discussing a bit later, and then just how all these strategies combine and work together so that we can at least analyze our reading processes as a class or as an individual, and so on. So this video will serve as a summation of my personal experiences throughout this course, what I've learned, what I've done as a student, and possibly even where I'm going with it.
Okay, so what am I going to be doing? Well, we're going to be talking about genre, think alouds, multimodality, and presentations, and it's a long-winded, off-centered recording of me just being me. So what's going on here? I'll be talking through my assignments in the order of my portfolio. I'll discuss the critical reading journal and all the sections of this. Then I'll move on to my analysis of grant proposals before going to talk about reading the state of the field for the multimodal projects and then having some overall reflections, although in this case I moved the reflections to the end of this instead of the first thing in the portfolio. So first we'll be discussing the Think Aloud protocols or the critical reading journal. So this is interesting. It does tie into one of our readings, and it's something that I had covered before, that we're supposed to at least record our thoughts that we have during our reading process, and well, everything takes much longer. And I originally did this by putting notes onto a PDF, which is where I thought it was properly organized, but then I had to move it over to a Google Doc, and that was a huge mess. So then I just went on to putting thoughts as I was reading things to keep track of my page number. So the first reading that we covered was rhetorical genre studies. And this one, I mean, I disagree that there are so many things that involve genre, specifically genre sets and genre systems, as I believe that once combined, all genres within these sets and systems form something new. Of course, awareness of certain categorical features of genres and how they work and how one can integrate into these systems is indeed done through some uptake. Having awareness of the tropes of certain discourses or disciplines can help a person entering into a certain field. So it is important to have these systems in place, or to have an awareness of the systems in place. Moving on to the next reading, I just had an overall comment over the Think Aloud protocols, mostly that I didn't record my thoughts for some reason. But I found it weird that it would just focus on fourth grade students' responses, although they are also young enough to be impacted the most by these strategies because they can properly implement them in life. It's hard to take an adult like myself and make them do these things without there being some sort of dissonance between the act of thinking aloud and keeping the information retained that's actually being read. But still, interesting. Then we have genre as social action, which deals with some reductionism, But people like their genres, so classification is better than genreification for some reason. But I did agree that genre is composed of recognizable forms bound together by an internal dynamic. But genres are complex, and the naming systems for them are even more so. And then there's some talk about artifacts and how they are kind of representations of where a genre was in a set time. And then there's just some talk over there, like the principles that define genres: affirmation, reaffirmation, purification, subversion, all sorts of things, and going along with a closed formal system that is intended to mimic a sort of form, but I won't go into that too much because there's just a whole lot to discuss there. So going on to rhetorical analysis, really, I just think that it'd be difficult to understand with this reading how persuasion works, given that the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of persuasion not only relies on the speaker, but the message, the receptivity, the constraints of the audience, the language of the time. So like something that was written 50 years ago would not be as effective today unless the reader is familiar with only language of 50 years ago, and so on. It's a very influx thing to try and examine how people may be persuaded by a particular thing. Well, it's kind of an interesting read. Then moving on to the big monster, which was Shaping Written Knowledge. This one has my most notes, and I did these originally by using the transcribing feature on Word to record my thoughts as they went along. But I have some big notes because of this, and they're not very organized. Eventually, after page 60 or 70 or so, I transitioned to just typing in notes. So my thoughts do become a little more clear, but more like I'm recording just the important bits of information, which was good for me in finding things about this reading again. Not so good for the expectations of the assignment. And then get this one that does talk about like agent, agency, scene, purpose, identification, and consubstantiality, which I cannot believe is even a term, are considered Burkean. And then I do agree with textual and contextual analyses are different, and each have their own purposes and examinations. And moving along with that, the interesting thing about this is when it starts going into the conversation with Isaac Newton, and his rhetorical problem and strategy was just that he had a very sort of reader response sort of methodology in establishing a sort of norms for scientific journal entries, although not really, but still close enough. And it was a sort of back and forth dialogue that was the important part of establishing these systems or the standardization of how to even present certain scientific findings. So he had to become much more concise and descriptive of his processes in order that they could be replicated. And this replication is something that's extremely important in the scientific community. So much so that later on it did get taken up by certain other fields such as sociology and psychology. And then this also leads into the instructions in regard to preparation of manuscript in 1929, which is the early foundation of the American Psychological Association, which we know as APA now. It was at 6.5 pages, which is just ridiculous. So aside from that, confrontations between two different fields actually, or people, lead to a sort of newfound establishment of certain things. We're going to the state of the multimodal field, which the state of the multimodal field is one that has taken movements through various justifications or integration of several modes of expression, where it could be using multimodality as a means to keep students motivated, applying change theory as a critical lens, examining the socio-epistemic connections between visualization activities and motivation, using video essays in interdisciplinary fields, using group projects and website creation to explore literary hypertext, combining shoe poems and literary analysis to create interactive analyses, and then using storyboarding as a method of planning and visualizations of video projects and meshing this with Common Core standards in composition. Although I think most interestingly was the use of storyboarding. I did actually think the whole process was useful in the classroom, because you are tasking students. It's because it is the professor's obligation to set their students up for success and to teach them skills that they're going to be using. And it does act as a way to become concise in their language by even using storyboards as an elevator pitch, or becoming aware of the different modes and representation of these modes and what multimodal truly is. It's just something that students need to know going forward. An example, like I do have these little bits of images that I created of me doing the whole storyboarding process, me as a potato, and then me attacking myself for some reason. But aside from that, it's something that could be very useful for students going forward. But moving on, we do have my analyses of successful grants, and this is one of the last things that I'll talk about. So obtaining funding for projects, research, and necessary materials is a laborious process that requires several strategies to be successful. And with that, we do have several things that I had to look at with grants, even going through mischievous sort of grant applications. But grant seekers must be able to effectively search through a variety of opportunities to find a grant that both connects with the project and is not associated with the dubious organizations such as this, trying to leech money from unsuspecting seekers. To this end, succinct wording, good research strategies, and perseverance are ideal skills in situations such as these. Seekers should be familiar with the standard vocabulary of the genre, while also being aware of who to contact within an organization, consult over prices of needed items or services, how to create cost projections and timelines, and what voices are needed in particular situation. More so, I learned that looking at 6 different things for this project, the biggest issue that I came across involved being able to find things that directly tied into multimodal projects. After some meetings with Dr. Beauchamp, a lot of this can be tied to the idea that most people already have access to technology, and a number of free programs and apps are available for use by the general public. To this end, not much funding is needed for schools or universities that are looking at utilizing multimodal projects. However, this unfortunately also means that a lot of the cost of technologies fall upon the student, whereby creating something that is both exciting, new, educational, but also restrictive and possibly capable of outcasting the more financially unfortunate. Regardless, I looked at a few different calls and grants, with the more interesting one involving a project that wanted to digitize existing physical works of textual and visual art across various museums, wanting to create an emergency network for aging pieces. But I think that covers the entire portfolio.
Anyway, I hope that this helps put the semester that I experienced into perspective. I hope you learned something. I hope you could understand my processes as an individual a little bit better. Um, so, stay home, stay safe, and good luck.